Quantum mechanics is a study of what things are doing when you're not watching them. Let that sink in. When you're not looking at an electron, it evolves into multiple different possible states. So the way I do a typical experiment is I set up a system like an electron in some known state. I turn on a magnetic field and I don't look at it. And I let it evolve in time. And what it does is it branches into these possibilities. And then when I do measure it, I get only one of those possibilities, from an initial known state into possibility A or possibility B. But this word or is really important. Is it in one state or the other? Is it in both states? None of those statements are correct. When Niels Bohr was asked, where is the electron really? His answer was, to be? What does it mean to be? The problem is the language, because quantum mechanics tells us that in addition to non-existence down here, where there's nothing, the void, and then the existence that we're familiar with, where there are real things happening, physical activity, there's this intermediate realm that quantum mechanics points to of possibilities. So does it exist? Well, no, not physically, but yes, it has an impact on the physical world. So we have to be really careful with our language. The main idea today that I'm going to present to you is objects in and of themselves are not real. Only relationships are real. And this is not even a real stretch for mainstream physics, except that they'll mainly apply it to particles like electrons and protons. I'm going to suggest that it's also true for more complex systems like ourselves, but it's not really in doubt in quantum physics anymore. So there's 3 experiments I'll just briefly show you that illuminate this. One is the Bell tests. How many people are familiar with the Bell test, Bell inequalities? So you have 2 entangled particles like Lincoln and Piper were talking about, and they spread apart from each other. They're entangled, so they have some matching correlated states. And then over here, you decide to measure in the same direction. You measure this way or you measure that way. And because they're entangled, you'll always get the same answer, spin up or spin down based on how you measure. But what happens then if you measure differently, like up here and sideways here, or just change the angles at which you measure? You get correlations of how often you get spin up and spin down. And in brief, you can calculate exactly, precisely what quantum mechanics suggests you should get in terms of probabilities for matching between these 2 particles. And from that, you get these correlations, and the conclusion is that you show that these particles leave the middle, they get to here, and just before you measure them, you can ask the question, does the state actually exist before you measure it? Do you get what I'm saying? The answer is no. There's no physical information about what actually exists prior to measuring. Instead, there's this unknown possibility, but there's no actual thing traveling. There's no actual property, a definite property traveling. And it's not that there's no property traveling, it's that there's this superposition of possibilities. We really don't have the language to talk about it. And this test, so it was done 30 years ago or something like that, and then there's loopholes. People keep saying, well, you didn't do this right, and so it still could not be conclusive. So this loophole was really, I think, one of the last ones. They decided how to set the detectors based on starlight that was emitted like at least 600 years ago. And so they would know that unless those stars were conspiring to make the experiment work out well, then clearly the conclusion is that properties don't exist in and of themselves prior to measurement. Yeah. How many of you feel lost right now? Okay. So I'm going to connect this all to the experience of synchronicity, to the experience of meeting someone by accident in the right place at the right time. Because that's what got me started thinking about this work. I'm passionate about experiencing life as a flow of meaningful experiences. And the world around us, we think that we're walking out into a determined, fixed set of circumstances, and we just have to cope. We have to figure out how to react to it. But what I'm going to try and show is that what we're really walking into is a collection of possibilities. And that from that, depending on the choices we make, we live in a responsive cosmos. The circumstances which come our way are actually in response to the choices we make. So that's where I'm going to try and get to. I'm actually, in that aim, I'm going to skip the next two experiments and just share that there are two other experiments that came out in this past year which support this idea of relationality. And if you want to talk to me about the validity of these experiments or of this process, you can come talk to me about this, okay? The first one is the Vigner's friend experiment, and the second one is this one on relationality. So I'm going to pass over those and come back to this main idea. Objects in and of themselves aren't real. It's our interactions with them that make reality. Only relationships are real. This is the recent work I'm doing, which I find really just so exciting and fun. If I take a picture of this city, and I take it on an iPad, and you see it moving around there, that's what you're used to looking at a phone. It's a two-dimensional image. It's flat. It's not reality. But this thing on the right is a hologram of a city. Oops. I think I can do it this way. Okay, so I'll let that play while I chat. So a hologram is different from, in one way, you can see that there's some depth to it, right? And as you move it, you actually move around the city. It's like you're looking down at this real model. But watch this. It's not actually there. It appears there, but it's a trick of the light. It's just a flat piece of film. So the picture on the left is a one-to-one map. It's like there's one point on the picture that corresponds to one point on the map, on the photograph. The top of the building in the middle corresponds to the top of the iPad. Just like if you're driving in the city, a point on the map better correspond to a point in the city, otherwise you're going to get lost. But on the right, when he or she is moving the hologram around, you see the tops of the buildings moving across the film because it's three-dimensional. It appears three-dimensional. So everything is moving relative to everything else. The image is not stuck to the film in the same way. That's what makes a hologram special. So what I'm... There we go. What I'm presenting to you today is, imagine that the world itself is an actual hologram. It employs the same mathematics as this holographic representation. And that's what I've found is true from the physics of quantum mechanics. I'm trying to reformulate quantum mechanics in a way that highlights this. So here we have the physical world. This is our reality. This is what we experience every day as we walk through the world. But as you saw, there's some film behind it that is it's actually projecting that image. There's some way in which that image is illusory. And there's a light traveling through the film, and the result of that is this picture, this three-dimensional realistic image of a city. That film, you see it has gray and white and black lines. It's just it's an interference pattern. You wouldn't recognize it at all as a city. It just looks like a bunch of scratches on plastic. But when you shine light through it, it recreates the structure that light would have if it was bouncing off the city, and it looks like a city. So I'm going to loosely tie this into the physics of Maya. Maya is the Sanskrit term for the world as illusion. And I'm going to tie this into synchronicity, because a synchronicity is an event which appears in your life out of the blue. A minute ago, was it bound to happen? Can we say? The world itself presents itself to us in the moment. And in this model, it renders itself for us, in relationship to us. The observation we make in the moment renders the reality right before our eyes. So the idea that it was there prior in some definite way doesn't hold up. So we walk around in the world actually rendering and manifesting, or it's not quite the right word, rendering the particular reality that we're coming into contact with for us, in relationship to us. And so the physics of Maya is this idea that this world itself was an illusion a minute ago, and then it appears and it seems really real. The question I'm going to ask you today is, which map are we using? Because this map determines what image shows up in the physical world. But we can't see the map, and the question is, how do we adjust those maps to bring about a specific set of circumstances? Does that sound good? So let's talk for a minute about holograms. This is a photograph. I take a photograph of the goblet, and there's, like I said, there's a one-to-one map between the image and the paper that it's on. So the top left of the goblet is on the top left quadrant of the paper, and when I cut it in quarters, I get 4 corners of the goblet, just like you would expect. I cut a picture in quarters, I get 4 pieces. Space-time is what this is, and it divides and dissects. And that's the duality. That's the sense of being able to separate things from each other, that we get so tripped out by entanglement because that's precisely what's not happening. Things are connected across great distances in some way. Well, space-time, we're just familiar with it. We take it for granted. It divides and dissects things. It's the way that we separate things out. Science itself, sire is the root of science, or sindere, and it means to cut or to divide. That's what we assume we're doing when we study science. A hologram is different. A hologram is what happens when we take a Fourier transform into the frequency representation. What we do is we do a process, this Fourier transform, which gets rid of the spatial aspects of it and converts it into frequencies. How many of you have ever listened to your radio and changed the EQ to get more high-end or more low, more bass? Okay, that's what they're doing is a process that essentially converts it into frequency space, has a spectrum, alters the spectrum by either raising or lowering some portion of the bandwidth, and then turning it back into space-time, and then playing it for you. And the whole, you've cut out some of the information, but the whole song still plays, it's just been altered in sound. So here, what we do is when we cut the film, there's not a relationship between the top corner of the glass to the particular point on the film. It's now the whole glass is now appearing in all pieces of the film. This is amazing. The glass, information about the glass exists everywhere throughout the film. If I cut it in eighths again, it would happen again. So somehow the pieces of the hologram are interfering and talking to each other, in relationship with each other, and creating a whole image as a result. So the whole is important to create the final outcome. Frequency space is holistic. Let's do this. Holistic mapping can be illustrated right here in this room. Take your hand and hold it above and make a shadow of something beneath you. You can just even hold it above your other hand. And notice, try and look at the edge of the shadow. And you can see on the coffee cup here, it's blurry. How many of you see a blurry shadow? Okay, so that's what we're after. So the coffee cup is capturing the light coming through a window, through some slats in the window. And the slats in the window are sharp-edged. You know, it's plastic. It's got a crisp edge. But by the time the light gets to the cup, it's bent around the corners of that edge. It's diffracted. And so when it gets to the cup, it blurs. It spreads out. Now, we know how that works, but what is really going on there? If I think of this as really a picture of the window, it's just the light from above the slat is going and it's hitting the cup. Light from below the slat is getting blocked and it's creating a blank spot, a shadow. This is really taking information from a region around the edge of the slat, a region slightly above where light's getting through and slightly below where it's blocked, and averaging that, merging it all together to give you a shadow that's blurred, not crisp. So this is the wholeness of light. It's saying that light is the shadow is dependent upon a region of space, not a specific space. There's a region of the slats on the window right here that correspond to a region of the cup. It's no longer this point here corresponds to this point here, and this point here corresponds to this point here. This is holism. This is what the hologram is pointing to as well. And it's shown by just looking at a shadow. So I want to do a brief example of how this works mathematically. You can just do a quick exercise with me. Is this frequency high or low? It's relatively low. I'll give you that one. Because the next one's going to be different. So this is a low frequency in the sense that it's oscillating from black to white pretty slowly. Or pretty It's a pretty long spread between the white bands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot that in frequency space. There's really one frequency here. There's one pace at which it repeats. And so it's going to be a low frequency, which means it's going to be a short distance from the center of the frequency space graph. So on the bottom, we have the center is 0, and we've got a dot just a little bit to the left showing that there's a low frequency present. There's also a dot to the right, indicating that the pattern can go left to right or it could go right to left. It doesn't really matter. It's just a symmetric aspect to it. But this is one low frequency element that we could plot. Here's a quiz for the next one. Is the frequency high or low? Higher. Okay. What direction is it? Up and down. So what do you expect to see on the bottom? Dots will be farther from the center line and on the vertical axis. You are correct. So that's great. So we put one frequency present there, and it shows up in the picture on the top. Here's a quiz for you. What do you expect to see? You're going to see at an angle a pretty high frequency mark, a dot that's far from the center. So this black dot tells us about the pattern. This is really cool. I place one dot, one pixel in frequency space, and I fill up the entire space of the picture with information or with a pattern. I've I can change frequency space in one specific location, and I change all of real space. Imagine that there is some way you can change frequency space that represents our world. It would affect the entire cosmos at once. It's a holistic representation. You add one frequency to this graph, and you get that frequency present as oscillations throughout the entire space. So it's a way in which we're not confined to right where we are. We're not even confined to planet Earth. The frequencies represented here are cosmic. I mean, there's no separations in frequency space. So let me continue, and we'll see if that gets answered. So here's where I think it gets really cool. You have this picture on the top left. It's a picture of the city. And pretty soon we'll be able to tie this back into synchronicity. Okay? Picture of the city. Here's a bunch of dots in frequency space. If you take every one of these dots and from it you apply a series of bands of black and white lines in some direction at some frequency, you can recreate this picture. Does that make sense? It's just a combination of white and black lines in different directions. It's amazing. It's a map. And it's a holistic map because if I put black dots over some small region, if this is a photograph and I put black dots over a small region of the photograph, all I would not be able to see is the region I blacked out in the photograph, right? That's a one-to-one map where I block out some region and that's gone. Here, I block out one small region of the picture, and look what happens to the photograph. There's artifacts of variations in the intensity of light that change. The whole picture is messed up. There's actually multiple copies of the building some distance apart. When I change one small portion of the frequency spectrum of this picture, the entire picture is affected in its quality. That wasn't supposed to happen. So now I want to stretch your mind a little bit more. This is the really crux of my work. What if this holistic aspect, this holistic mathematics, applied also to time? What if you're no longer just, because right now we're stuck in the now. But in order to apply this, you have to leave behind the now and enter a frequency space that corresponds to time. It's hard to do. It's hard conceptually to understand, and I want you to leave behind your mental understanding of it for a moment and allow this to settle in, because you have to be able to feel it a little bit. If light leaves this point here on the left, see that blue thing is supposed to be a photon, leaving some source and traveling to the right, so now it goes over here, and now it goes over here. That's the path of light. It's just like light traveling from the light bulb through space to get to your eyes, or to get to your skin and bounce up to your eyes. That's what it does. It travels across the space. it looks like that. It looks like a line connecting point A to point B to point C. But these are over time. This is a path over time, right? If I Fourier transform that, just like I did with the photograph, I get a map. The map is, when I say map, what I mean is it's like a recipe. If my ingredients are frequencies of all sorts of high or low frequencies, and I add them together in just the right way, according to this recipe, a lot right here, a few right here, and very little down here, that recipe, and then I do an inverse Fourier transform to get back to space-time, I get this path. I get a photon traveling from the light to my eyes in time. So this is a point at which I expect I've lost a lot of you. So I'm going to slow down and make this an analogy with a map, an actual map. Imagine you are starting a new job, and you don't know how to get to work, and it happens that your GPS is out of data for the month. So you're not going to use your GPS. What would you do? You'd print out a map before you leave. So you print out this map, and that's all you have, this one map. And you get on the road, and you follow it, you go right, and you go left, and you get to work. Great. The next day, you have your map, and you get in the car, and you head to work. But on the way, you see a coffee shop that you hadn't noticed before. And you want to take a detour to get coffee. So you turn the steering wheel, but you can't. It's stuck. Because your map told you the entire path through time. Your map captures the entire trajectory of you through the city in some predetermined way. It's holistic. It's not breaking it down into now and now and now and now. It's saying the entire path is predefined. And so you're stuck. You can't turn to get coffee. So what would you do? First of all, you give up and you go to work. It's the only thing you can do. But what would you do the next day? A different map, right? When the first map doesn't work, you change your map. That's the first rule. So now you have two maps. And now you're on your way to work, and you can stop and get coffee. But you don't have to, because you already have your original map. Now you have choice. So every choice that you can make requires a different map. If you want to have the free will to make these choices, you need to have a map representing each possibility of the journey that you're going to make. So what we have is different paths require different maps. You have the path going from building A to building C, and that is one map. If I do a Fourier transform on that, I get this map. If I do a Fourier transform on this geometry, I get a different map. That corresponds to putting a detector in the middle building and having a shorter path of travel. Because the mathematics is taking into account the beginning and the ending in creating the map. Can you see how this can maybe start to relate to some really interesting questions about the beginning and ending of our journey? And how does a synchronicity appear out of nowhere? It's the end point. Or maybe it's not even the end, it's the middle point towards a journey towards something that we're trying to experience, and the synchronicity helps us get there. And the path we're on is actually defined by one of these maps, which includes the end point. So I think it's really cool. And then I'm going to make one final connection. This is the holographic image. This physical world is a holographic image in space and time that corresponds to the holographic film, because this math right here is simply the interference pattern you would see on a holographic film in some abstract way. I don't know where this holographic film exists. I'm not saying there's a real holographic film made of vinyl somewhere in the cosmos projecting us. But in some very real mathematical and physical way, these principles hold up, I believe. I'm trying to show. So we have the holographic image, which is all of the physical reality that we know, but behind it there's some kind of holographic film that's leading to this image to appear in our midst. I'm going to bring up this quote from Patanjali, and I appreciate the quote that was brought up in the last session. Due to his changelessness, can I say her changelessness? Changes in the mind stuff are always known to the Purusha, who is its Lord. Changelessness. You can't change a map that doesn't have time associated with it. When we did this process, we took physical reality and we got rid of time and we transformed it into this frequency space. There's no time in frequency space. If I'm driving to work and I want to take a left, I can't just add a new map, because I would have to do that at now. I'd have to do that at 8:50 p.m. or a.m. or whatever. But there's no time in frequency space, so it just doesn't make sense to have any kind of now moment where you would change it. So this frequency space representation, this holographic film, is changeless. In the same way that we talk about Maya and the underlying illusion that we experience, or the overlying illusion on top of some underlying source of information. So I think there's a connection there. I'm going to transition into work that you might have seen before if you've seen me talk prior years. This is my work on synchronicity, and I'm going to try and tie it into what I've just talked about. So let's say I'm walking to the train station, and I want to get on a subway and go to the theater. I want to see a show. I walk into the station, and I'm going to be very close to being late, so I'm worried about getting on the right train. And I walk into the station, and I hear the train pull in. And I go, oh no, because the train's going to pull out in like a few seconds, and I'm not even at the station yet. I have to get down to the platform. But I'm going to encourage you to run, because running fixes everything, right? How does this setup work? I'm going to suggest that by running, by taking an action in the direction of the experience you want to have, you will influence, I don't know that that's the right word, but you will influence the probabilities of a specific situation occurring which allows that to happen. You follow me? That's going to be what we call a synchronicity. A synchronicity is a meaningful event in the moment which happens to lead to something we're wanting to experience. So in the moment, it looks random, but we realize if we look carefully, in the long term, it leads to something that we're trying to experience. So I can either catch the subway or not catch the subway, but let's look at this. If I do catch the subway, I could be on time, and I could not be on time. If I don't catch the subway, I could still possibly be on time, probably not as likely, and I could not be on time. So I'm going to put apples on the branch. If I catch the subway, I'm more likely to be on time. If I don't catch the subway, I'm more likely to not be on time. You follow that? Okay. So now there's some more apples to add. When I run because I want to have a certain experience. I'm going to add in this new element that I call anticipated experience. I'm anticipating tasting popcorn on my tongue at the theater. The feeling, the sensation. I'm anticipating meeting a friend and having a conversation that's deep and meaningful, and seeing the sights and sounds of the play and experiencing awe and wonder. These are the things that make me run. So let me finish the example. When I run, I'm placing apples on the branches of the tree which have that experience. So if I'm on time to the play, I'm going to have the experience of tasting popcorn on my tongue. I'm going to have the experience of connecting with a friend. If I'm on time over here, I'm going to have the same experiences. So these both get big apples. If I don't get on time to the play, I'm not going to experience those inner sensations, and so I'm going to place a small apple on that branch. Does that make sense? Okay. Finally, I'm going to combine these branches. I've got one that was just causal, right? These are all happening because it's obvious that that's the way it works. If I'm on time to the subway, then I'm more on time to the play. But there's this other backwards sort of effect, which is coming from the anticipation of the experience itself. There's lots of ways that the play could go, but the experience I'm having is what drives this. Places a large apple on being on time. And I combine them, and I get a big, large apple here because there's a big apple on top and bottom, and the other ones average out to being smaller. If you didn't see that, it looks like this. Big and big averages to really big. And then I'm going to average these two, and I look here, and I get, if you can't see it, this one is about 20% or something bigger than this one. It's a little bit bigger. What I've done is shown that mathematically I can increase the likelihood of something happening to delay the train long enough for me to get on. So now some random occurrence might occur, like a bicyclist getting stuck in the doors because they can't pull the bike all the way into the train. It's not related to me. It's not because of me. But I've correlated myself to that branch of the tree on which that happens because of the final outcome that it leads to, me being on time for the play. Do you follow that? So that's what we call a synchronicity. And the other branch goes away. Now I'm on the subway, and that's my life. That's the path I'm on. So each of those branches was a map. It's a trajectory of various things in the environment doing their thing through life described from beginning to end. And I was able to get onto a map which included the bus or the train waiting for me long enough. But there's a whole other set of circumstances that could have unfolded in which the train left and I'd be on the other map. So the question is, how do we move through these timeless, spaceless infinity of maps onto the branches which are meaningful to us? So a synchronicity is a meaningful event which becomes more likely because it leads to an experience you're seeking to have. It leads to those apples on the top of the tree where I have the experience of popcorn on my tongue. And that only can happen if the subway gets delayed, which can only happen if the bicyclist has trouble getting through the doors. So that's a synchronicity. So I'm going to be in the bookstore next because I wrote a book at connecting this to flow. And you can come to the bookstore and get a book signed if you'd like to get one. When I was really pulling this together to submit to a publisher, I realized that synchronicity is important to me because it leads to the experience of flow. When I pay attention to synchronicities in my life, I'm able to navigate the obstacles that come into my path. Because I don't see there being only one way to get to the end result. I'm on this branching tree, and there's actually lots of apples. And as I'm navigating that branching tree, when somebody says no to me about something, and that branch is blocked, there are other ways to navigate. So I get into flow by being able to work with the synchronicities of daily life. And one practice that I include in the book is this, the Lorax, L-O-R-R-A-X. Listen to life circumstances. And open your mind to let go of your initial reaction to what you think is going on. A lot of times, things get in our way. I guarantee you by the end of the night, something will happen which you need to listen to a little more carefully. And then open your mind and let go of your preconceived notions about what it means or where it's heading. And from there, you're able to reflect a little bit and get some clarity on what you might be able to do with that, how it might actually benefit you. And at that point, you might need to release your attachment to where you were going to go previously to allow some new, better thing to emerge. And from there, you can act. And when we take the time to listen, open, reflect, and release before we act, we find ourselves in alignment with the circumstances around us. And then through synchronicity, the circumstances, I think, will align with us. It's this mutual dance that we do between ourselves and our environment. So life is a fence. We fill in the gaps with what we think is going on. But all we actually have that is real, that we know, are the interactions we have. The fence posts are the interactions. Those are the relationships we have. That's how we know what things are, is because we interact with them. It's how we know who we are, because we're interacting with our environment. So only the relationships are real. I'm going to close by suggesting that you make choices every day. And you might feel like some of those choices are not that meaningful. But every choice you make is navigating through that tree towards some apples and away from other apples. So I encourage you to think about what those apples are, what anticipated experiences you're having. As you make choices every day, make them count. So I want to tell you about two things happening. One is a Flow Summit that I'm going to be talking at, a keynote at. It's just an online free event that I would really encourage you to check out. I'm not putting it together. I'm just helping let you know about it. November 11th through the 14th. You can find it at findflowtoday.com. And then I have a book signing today in the bookstore. I'm going to be leaving shortly afterwards, so if you would like a book, please come get them now. And I'd love to share the work I'm doing with you. I have a course that I'm launching in December called the Living in Flow course, based on the work in the book, and going in more detail and depth into exercises you can do to align more with how flow is showing up in your life, to get back into flow, to live from the heart and find more authenticity, and be able to see little synchronicities in your path that are available to you right now without having to know what the end zone really is. So please check that out, and you can find me. I left cards on some of the seats, so if you'd like to take one of those cards, you're welcome to do that. Thank you so much.